And then the next year, the harvest is normal, output goes way up. And if you just look at it in terms of numbers, you say, well, this economy's all over the map. And then after the Fed, you say, wow, it's much more stable. Well, duh. The economy isn't as agricultural anymore. Hello? So again, this is not a fair comparison. When you correct for all this, you don't in fact find the Fed to be an improvement. And then, of course, you compare what kind of record has it had with the dollar. But looking at, for example, the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 was not caused by some spontaneous market institution. We had people at the time, contemporaries, said what caused this thing was the Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States that was created, that was extremely inflationary, got the economy on a sugar high, creating a lot of money, borrowing is very easy, a real estate boom gets going, all the usual things that we typically see in these situations, and then it crashes. And people at the time put two and two together. They said, the banking system is rotten, and it's putting our economy in these cycles. And Thomas Jefferson, in the wake of 1819, said, you know what we need? And he urged his friend to introduce his legislation for the reduction of the circulating medium. He said, we've got to get rid of all the excess paper over and above the coins to back it, and ultimately move to a system where all we're trading in is precious metal coins. And there were other people who were confirmed. John Adams was confirmed in his hard money views by watching the Panic of 1819, and so on and so forth. In 1873, we're told there was a long depression that went for 6 years. Not so, according to the more recent reconstructions of the data. In fact, even the New York Times, the one time it was ever right, was when it conceded, and I almost regret that, because I wish it hadn't broken. It's kind of a shame. You know, it's like the guy who's got the perfect game up until, the ninth inning and whatever. Well, they say that it turns out that, according to economic historians, there was no long depression of the 1870s. Let me just share this one little passage. Recent detailed reconstructions of 19th century data by economic historians show that there was no 1870s depression. Aside from a short recession in 1873, in fact, the decade saw possibly the fastest sustained growth in American history. Employment grew strongly, faster than the rate of immigration. Consumption of food and other goods rose across the board. On a per capita basis, almost all output measures were up spectacularly. By the end of the decade, people were better housed, better clothed, and lived on bigger farms. Department stores were popping up in medium-sized cities. America was transforming into the world's first mass consumer society. Well, finally, very, very quickly on this Fed thing, because I do want to say one more thing before we conclude. Again, I'm sorry for going so long. Anybody who goes this long is like a semi-crank who forgets about people's attention spans, and I apologize for that, but I cannot help myself here. On this whole matter of bank panics. People say, we had these bank panics, right? Before we had the Fed, we had this panic in 1873, and this panic in the 1890s, and then after the Fed, we didn't have these panics, and isn't that great? Well, okay, well, it turns out there are two factors to consider. Number one is Canada didn't have any of those panics in the late 19th century, and they didn't have a central bank that was alleviating them. They didn't get a central bank until 1934. They had zero panics. And then when in 1929, over the course of the Great Depression, 9,000 U.S. banks failed. You know how many Canadian banks failed? Zero. So what the heck was going on in Canada? The answer was, in the U.S. we had this lovely regulation called unit banking, which said that no bank can have more than one branch. So obviously, in a period of time when transportation is very primitive, that means every bank is lending to like a 3-inch area. So anything bad happens in that 3-inch area, well, that's it. That's all she wrote. They can't diversify. They're extremely fragile. And so, yeah, well, you wind up getting a lot of problems like that. Canada didn't have that problem at all. So, number one, it's an intervention problem. But number two, we find, I've got a paper by a professor at the University of California at Berkeley from just 2009. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, there is no evidence of a decline in the frequency of panics during the first 15 years of the existence of the Federal Reserve. That's a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, big anti-Fed bastion that. But this is becoming sayable now. These sorts of things have indeed become sayable. The panics went away because of deposit insurance, not because of the Federal Reserve. My last point, I won't talk about stimulus spending. That's just, does anybody think stimulus spending helps? I'll gladly talk about that in the question period. But I want to leave with this, with the situation that young people face. And I am not a pessimist by nature. I am super optimistic, even when I have no right to be. That's just the way I am. You know, everything in my life I love. I enjoy every minute of it, except for the kid with the broken glass thing. And that, I'll admit, that was a bit of a drag. Worrying about that. But even then, I was able to call up physician friends of mine, some of whom I knew in college, but also when people I've met at events like this. I have a physician friend who said to me, you know, I've read your books and they've benefited me, so if you ever need some medical advice. And so I called him up and said, guess what? So that was wonderful. But anyway, this does need to be known, because here's the greatest myth of all, that people have misled themselves into thinking that, if something is desirable, all we need to do is demand it. Resources are unlimited. Taxation can always get us whatever we want, because there are always enough rich suckers to be expropriated. Well, it turns out we are living through the disproof of that notion. Because we are about to, okay, so we know that the national debt, you know, $14 trillion is really high, how are we going to pay? But what are they going to do about Social Security and Medicare? Mostly Medicare, which right now, the present value of the unfunded liability there is $111 trillion. Now that's going to be a little bit of a pain to try and pay, especially when we consider that the Republicans are going to sweep in, and, you know, we've all been through this one before. They're going to repeal everything and everything will be fine. We've been scammed on this one a million times. I'd love to believe it's true now. I would love nothing more than to come back and say, guys, I was so wrong. I was so wrong when I came to see you last time. But they're going to cut $100 billion from the budget. Wow. Wow. That's like $3 off a trip to the moon. Great. Oh my gosh. I think I said that once at some speech. Somebody on Facebook devised an actual coupon with an astronaut on it. Save $3. Act now. Big savings. All right, so we've got this big problem. It's a problem that's gotten to the point where even it's not just like our people, it's not just Peter Schiff, it's not just Jim Rogers, not the usual names. It's also names we never hear, like Lawrence Kotlikoff of I think Boston University. Now he's a Democrat, he's an establishment guy, and here's what he says. We have 78 million baby boomers who, when fully retired, will collect benefits from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that on average exceed per capita GDP. The annual cost of these entitlements will total about $4 trillion in today's dollars, so annually. Yes, our economy will be bigger in 20 years, but not big enough to handle this size load year after year. And he goes on to say, this is what happens when you run a massive Ponzi scheme for 6 decades straight, taking ever larger resources from the young and giving them to the old, while promising the young their eventual turn at passing the generational buck. Wow, when a Democrat, mainstream BU economist says it's a Ponzi scheme, like, this is out in the open now. It's gone mainstream. And this is all going to come to an end, he says, in a very nasty manner. The first possibility is massive benefit cuts visited on the baby boomers in retirement. The second is astronomical tax increases that leave the young with little incentive to work and save. And the third is the government simply printing vast quantities of money to cover its bills. Well, why couldn't it be all three of those? It seems quite possible. And then we're seeing the aging of the population. This is a serious issue. Now, it's not that we regret that we're able to enjoy longer lives. That's not the problem. That's great that we're able to enjoy longer lives, but nobody's making any provision for the healthcare costs associated with it. And it's many, many, many times more costs associated with the so-called old olds, what demographers call people between 66 and 85. We found that by 2050, the number of people over age 100 in the U.S. will have increased by 13 times. And then we look at all these other figures, whereby the number of people aged 80 will outnumber children under age 5. That's never happened in U.S. history. We have a situation in which, in 1940, we had more college-age kids than we had seniors. By 2040, we're going to have the number of senior citizens multiplying by 7 times, 75 million to 20 million college-age kids. How is this going to be taken care of? No one is answering the question. If it comes up, everybody just says, hey, look the other way, and they run away. We get no answer. But we need answers, because who's going to be paying for this? The young people who are going to be struggling their whole lives, working and working and working, harder and harder and harder, just to stand still in order to prop up a system that's obviously going to collapse anyway. I mean, this is their fate. There's nothing they can do about this. They're stuck in this. There's nothing we can do. There's no other way we can care for each other other than by loading greater and greater obligations on on ever more future generations. There's no other way to do this. There's no way to tax our way out of this, because the tax rates would have to be raised so high the economy would be destroyed. And plus, ever since 1950, we've seen that no matter what the tax rate is, the tax receipts have rarely exceeded 20% of GDP. This is like some kind of fixed ceiling, political, economic fixed ceiling. And so no matter what you do with taxes, there's just a limit, and you're not going to get more than that. So that is not a way out. You could destroy the currency, and we would have civil unrest. It would be unthinkable in a modern economy to see hyperinflation. It would be absolutely unthinkable. But yet, this isn't even being talked about. It's all what do we get on TV? Just trivialities. It's all trivialities, one after the other. And we won't even bother going into what's going on in the states. Oh, good grief. We got like 7 states whose pension funds are about to go bust by 2020. We got another 13 states that are going to go bust in 2025. And they're going to go bust in those years, assuming that they're making an 8% return every year between now and then. So they're obviously going to go bust far sooner than that. My favorite scheme was New York City. The governor supported a plan that would bail out the pension fund by borrowing from the pension fund. I mean, that's it. I mean, we're dead from the neck up. Like there are no solutions being proposed. So what do we do about this? We are on the edge of a major default simply because we believe for years and years and years that every year, basically, as Gary North says, every year society will just be the same as it was last year, give or take 3 or 4%. The idea of a default never enters into the picture. The idea that a Detroit that is a living example of regulation and spending and politics, no one saw the total collapse of Detroit. Here's a place where the height of the housing boom, median house price, $98,000. Then, a couple years ago, it dropped. It dropped to $14,500. You think, oh my gosh, it hit rock bottom. No, it didn't. The next year it was down to $7,000. 25% of the schools are closing, the money is gone, people are fleeing. Nothing like this has ever been seen in a U.S. city, and in comparison with the scale of the collapse, it was unreported, basically unreported. Is that a microcosm of our future? Well, maybe because of the situation that our wise overlords that we've had superstitious confidence in and superstitious reverence for have put us in. Our kids and our neighbors and friends have been waving incense in front of these people for decades, thinking there's no problem they can't solve, there's no problem that raising taxes 10% can't solve, and yet here we are staring it face to face. So what do we do? Well, that's a separate issue. That's what my book that's coming out on February 7th, called Rollback, it is sort of about. At the end I give some recommendations. But you give recommendations knowing that all the recommendations that would actually work will be dismissed as unrealistic, even though not adopting them is what's unrealistic. But for now, what my purpose was just to show that by falling for these myths, by falling into these traps, I don't want to say we, they have gotten us into this pickle that is very hard to get out of. We can get out of it in various ways if we're willing to make great sacrifices in the present, and we're willing to adopt, we're willing to return to an era in which we cared for each other. Instead of just pawning off people on government bureaucracies, which we looked out for each other. And we treated each other like human beings, humanely. We have to get rid of the smiley-face version of government that we were all taught in 6th grade, banish and discard that forever. And we have to likewise take the devil horns off the free market, if we're going to have any choice. We need to become knowledgeable, and one tool that I devised to help people with that, people who are busy, they have a million things to do, is I bought the domain learnaustrianeconomics.com. Easy way to learn all this stuff for free and on your iPod, whatever, so that we can be a formidable force. That they can fool some people, but there'll be fewer and fewer people they can fool. That's very important. But Frederick Bastiat, one of the great heroes of the last couple centuries, the New York Times derisively said, the Tea Party people are reading Frederick Bastiat. Oh, how terrible. Well, he was a great French economist. And he said that basically what goes on with the state is just mutual legal plunder. Where I'd be arrested if I went up and stole your money and gave it to somebody else. I'd be arrested for that. But if somebody asked the government to do it, if the government gun in the ribs, then that's somehow morally different, and that's okay. And he says, you know what the state is? The state is the great fiction by which everyone attempts to live at the expense of everyone else. That's the greatest fiction of all.